Hey everyone, welcome to this week's video. The video is a bit late also because today was actually voting day here in Kenya. I voted. I am a voter. I hope it's visible. So yeah, that's what's been happening, and that's why there's a bit of a delay with this video today. Either way, I hope you caught up with last week's video and I hope you enjoyed it, and welcome to today's video. We are going to be discussing sewing equipment, because I know last week I talked about your sewing room. Today we're talking about sewing equipment. As I have mentioned before, I did a whole Vlogmas series last year, and I'm going to link the playlist in the description, where I talked about sewing equipment in general. Every day I featured something you need in your sewing room, and a lot of the equipment that I featured were even some that regular sewers don't use. So do check out that playlist. It'll have way more than what I'm going to talk about today. So today we are going to talk about just the basic necessities that you need in your sewing room, that if you don't have, then you might get stuck somewhere in your project. So let's begin, and welcome. So before I begin with the sewing equipment that you need, I would first like to mention something that I know a lot of people do, and this is buying sewing kits for people who sew. A sewing kit, especially the commercial sewing kits, that I'll put the picture here. Yeah, so the commercial sewing kits are not the best quality in terms of what is put in the sewing kit. Those sewing kits are good for emergency situations, just having it. You know how you have a first aid kit? It's almost the same, having an emergency sewing kit. It's just for emergencies, and the quality of the things that you put in there is not necessarily the best for professional use or if you want to take sewing seriously. So do not get that as something you're going to say, okay, I've bought this whole, because you realize that they're also very cheap. Yeah, so don't say, I've got a scissor thread, seam ripper, tape measure in a sewing kit. Some of the things are okay, like the tape measure maybe and all that, but even the needles and the pins, they rust with time. The threads you always need to buy thread. The threads are also very, very weak. They break easily, so they're just for emergency. So don't buy a sewing kit and say, okay, I'm half done, I need to buy the rest. No, it's better if you create your own sewing kit. If you have to, get a bag or get a container and create your own sewing kit and buy those things individually, because you will buy the best quality of each of these things. So don't buy the commercial sewing kit, and don't gift anyone who's a professional in sewing or is sewing as a hobby on a serious basis. Do not buy for them as a gift, I beseech you. Sewing kits are for emergency, just something you have in the house or something you have in your bag in case you get an incident with your clothes or something when you're out. So that's just the disclaimer I wanted to start with before we begin with this series, and let's begin now officially. So I'm going to start with sewing machines, and I am going to dwell more on sewing machines next week, so I'm not going to really talk about them a lot this time around. But I do want to ask that you should not buy these three machines on your screen right now. Do not buy the handheld machine. Do not buy the mini sewing machine. Whether or not you have decided you're going to do sewing as a hobby or professionally, these are not machines that last very long. They are very fragile. They're very difficult to use. They're very difficult to maintain. They're very difficult to thread. They cannot even be serviced. So don't buy them. The last mini machine is a bit closer to a domestic portable machine, so it might not be as bad, but I don't think it lasts as long. Maybe if your child is interested in sewing and you don't want to spend so much and you want to see where their interest is going to be, then I would recommend the third one for sure. But still, I always think it's better to invest in a proper machine, because you can always resell the machine later if you're not interested in it. And either way, having a sewing machine is never bad, because you could learn how to do your own repairs and small sewing projects, whether or not it's just for your own benefit or if you just want to do something that is a hobby that will make you relax. So some of the things you should consider when you are buying a machine is the space you have. Do you have enough space to keep a machine? Some of these machines come with big tables, so you might need a space that you can be able to put a machine with a table, or you can get a portable machine where you just place it on the table you already have and then you put it aside after use. You have to consider first things like your budget, additional attachments. You may have to buy some things, which I'll dwell more on next week, because there's some basic things that a machine comes in, there's some you have to buy. Availability of spare parts, because there are some parts of your machine that will eventually need to be replaced. The ease of use, if you can actually use the machine, because there's some machines that are very complex to use. Service and maintenance, considering that if there are spare parts in the country and if it easily, you can easily service it. And the people who generally service machines understand your machine. The energy it uses. There's some energy saving machines, especially the ones that come from factories. You can actually buy a second-hand machine from a factory, especially the industrial ones, because they keep replacing their machines often. So sometimes they are still in very good condition and you don't have to buy a brand new one, which can be very expensive. Also the stitch options. So the more industrial your machine, the chances are it'll have less stitches. So most of the machines that usually have a lot of stitches are the domestic portable machines. Most industrial machines, you actually have to buy a machine for specific use. Like there's a machine for buttonholes, there's a machine for sewing straight stitches, there's a machine for zigzag or embroidery and all those things. So we'll dwell more on machines next week, but in a nutshell, that is it about machines. So one of the next very important equipment you should have is an iron. So an iron box also, when you're considering buying it, you have to consider your budget. And the best iron to get is the industrial steam iron. And generally, when you are buying an iron and you're starting out, I think a basic dry iron is fine, and maybe you can have a water bottle where you could spray, because you need to spray, you need to dampen the cloth when you're ironing it. And of course, when you're ironing very delicate fabric, you put another cotton cloth on top of the fabric and then you press it or iron it. There are different types of irons, steam irons, flat irons, smooth irons, and just there's a variety of iron boxes. There's also garment steamers. I'm sure you have seen some of these garment steamers, mostly used for gowns, because you can't really, there are some clothes that you can't iron when they are flat, and especially after they are finished and you've already ironed out all the seams and everything, you need a garment steamer, and basically the steam straightens out all the wrinkles, even as the outfit is hung either on a mannequin or a hanger or anything like that. So if you really do a lot of gowns and very elaborate outfits, then a garment steamer is very important, especially when you're done with sewing. But you always need the flat iron to iron out the seams and everything like that. So I hope this, in a nutshell, will help you decide what to buy. So next, there are measuring tools, and there are different types of measuring tools. Of course, the most important measuring tool that you should have without fail is a tape measure and a ruler. The rest of the measuring things you need to measure, basically, you can actually wing it. But if you can afford to buy the other types of rulers, then better for you. Of course, tape measure is the most important because it's what you use to take your body measurements. It's also what you use to measure your fabric and things like that. It's a very versatile measuring tool. And then you have a ruler. You can just have the regular ruler, but there is this thing called a sewing gauge that usually helps a lot of people with knowing how much seam allowance to leave, especially when you're cutting your outfit, just to know how much allowance you should leave for sewing. People like to use it specifically for that, and also just to mark certain points when you're doing different sewing projects. The French curve is mostly used for patterns, when you're making your patterns, especially the curved areas like the armhole, the neckline, the hips. That's when you really need a French curve, and it's not going to necessarily give you a perfect curve, but it will help you with the curves, at least to straighten them and make them smoother. Then you need the set square mostly for the right angles, especially if you want your bust, waist, and hips when you are drafting. If you want them to be parallel to each other, the set square really helps you with that. So it's mostly used when you're drafting. Then of course you need the long meter ruler. This one, I have both. I have wooden and I have the metal one, and they are both relatively very good. The wooden one is the most popular in Kenya. The metal one, I think it was imported. They really help you as well with measuring your fabric, especially when you're cutting. If you shop for fabric, you'll always see that they use this ruler. And also making sure your hems are straight, helping you measure very long clothes or fabrics or whatever, and also just doing those long lines, especially when you're making your patterns. It comes in very handy. The pattern master is something I would recommend for someone who is doing sewing as a hobby, because it's one of those things. It's a combination of a ruler, a French curve, and a set square. And it's useful for anybody, professionally or as a hobby. But if you are doing sewing as a hobby and you really don't want to invest in all these other tools, I would definitely recommend this. But definitely, if you can afford to have all of them, then you should have them. So in a nutshell, those are the measuring tools. Next, we have cutting tools. Basically, I focused on this, the scissor and the rotary cutter. I'm so sure that there are others. There's even an industrial rotary cutter. But I'm focusing on the scissor because scissor is the most accessible cutting tool. And you must have two types of scissors. And I use the word must because you cannot use the scissors you use to cut fabric to cut your paper, because it will become blunt with time. So have a paper scissor, which is usually very lightweight, can even have a plastic handle, and then a good fabric scissor. Most of the very good ones are fully made of metal, including the handle. But they do come in different weights, so make sure that you're comfortable holding the scissor while you're cutting, because if it's too heavy for your hand as well, you might actually injure your hand, especially if you're doing this professionally. It might actually affect your wrist. So just make sure you have a scissor that you can comfortably handle. The rotary cutter, I have seen it mostly with people who do quilts, although it can still be used to cut clothes, but it also means that you will need a mat. There's usually a mat that you need to buy when you're using a rotary cutter. You can see it in the second picture there, the green mat there, so that you don't damage your surface, whether it's a table or the floor or whatever. So those are the cutting tools that you could use. Definitely the scissor is the easiest to get. And do take note that fabric scissors, very good fabric scissors that last long, are not cheap. And yeah, so unless you just want to keep buying cutting tools, keep that in mind. So next we have pins and clips. I put both in the same list because technically they kind of do the same job. So the pins and the clips are used for holding fabric together when you're sewing. So pins basically penetrate to the fabric when you're sewing, and then the clips hold the fabric together, but they don't penetrate. So especially clips are awesome for things like leather or very delicate fabric you don't want holes on, and pins are generally for majority of the other fabrics. Pins also come in different types of widths, lengths, and all that. It really depends on what you buy and what you're using it for. So we can even go more in depth in all that, but in a nutshell, that's pins and clips. Then there is chalk. Chalk is generally used to make markings on fabric, and the beauty of chalk is that they make temporary markings. So that means after you're done with your sewing project, you can easily clean out the chalk marks. And there are two types of chalk that generally people use. You can just use the regular chalk that are used on blackboards. They work just as fine, or you can get the tailor's chalk, which is usually a bit more waxy. It has a waxy texture. I personally prefer just to use the regular classroom chalk. I find that it's even easier to clean out. But generally, chalk is the main tool used for making markings. So there's the thread. Generally, you need thread because that's what you need to put together your garment. Thread is also called yarn, and it's usually used to combine two or more fabric pieces together.
in your garments, accessories, or textile products. So threads can comprise of the same fiber as the fabric or different. And most of the time you actually just use a different one because some of these natural fiber threads are not the strongest. So you usually end up with one that's synthetic, like polyester, tends to be very strong. And yeah, anyway, you need different threads for whatever it is you're sewing. You need to know what the right thread is, just like the way you need to know the right needle, which I'm going to get into. Yes, so in a nutshell, that is threads. Now we are on needles. There are hand needles and machine needles. And the more I talk about these different parts, it seems like they need their own video just because of how deep they are and how complex they are. Either way, we get into the hand needles. As you can see, there are very many types of hand needles. It actually depends on the project you are working on. So of course, specifically for sewing needles, most of them are straight, but they also come into different widths. And you know when you're making clothes that there is hand stitching you do in some of the parts, whether it's making a hem or doing tacks before you stitch with a permanent stitch, or you're doing something decorative. So needles are diverse in that way. And also they vary depending on the kind of fabric you're working on. Same to machine needles, they come in various widths. The kind of machine also dictates the kind of needle you'll buy. There are numbers on the machine needle that mean different things. I don't want to get into that so much, but you can see the different parts of a machine needle. And there are also different nibs of a machine needle that is used to stitch. So in a nutshell, this is just needles. So you just know there's machine needle and hand needle, and they're not used in the same way. So in a nutshell, that's it. Then there is a seam ripper and thread snippers. So they kind of do the same job, but in a different way. So a seam ripper is usually used to undo your seams, especially if you stitched it badly. So it's basically to remove your stitches so that you can be able to repeat it. So sometimes it's called a stitch ripper or a seam ripper, and it basically just looks like the one in the picture. And then there is a thread snipper. A lot of tailors like this thread snipper, and sometimes they use it as a seam ripper and it annoys me. But it's very handy when you're just sewing on your machine and you just want to cut the thread. That's basically the primary use of it, just to cut the ends of a thread. It's not supposed to remove seams, but I've seen people who use it to remove seams. So that's the main difference, and they are very handy tools to have on hand as you sew. Lastly, you need stationery, because you need to write things down, you need to draw, you need to design, you need to put down your ideas, you need to just get organized. And that's what stationery helps you with, whether you're going to print out the information you're putting down or you're going to just write it. You just need to have a place where you can process your thoughts and your ideas, and that's the importance of stationery. Another thing is paper is stationery, especially the big roll of white paper or brown paper that you use to make your patterns. It's part of the stationery. So basically, stationery just helps you be organized, and it also helps you with part of your design process. You really cannot do much without stationery at hand. And I can't really pinpoint that there's some things you can do or cannot do without, because everyone's stationery needs are different. So just make sure you have something to write on, and you have the writing materials, and you have cutting equipment and pins and everything that helps you with your process. So in a nutshell, that is the list.
Well, that's the end of this week's episode, and I hope you've learned something about sewing equipment. Please don't forget, check the Vlogmas series I did. Vlogmas basically is vlogs just before Christmas. That's what Vlogmas means, just in case you've been wondering what I'm saying. I've put the link of the playlist in the description so that you can be able to see other equipment that I did not mention today. and I hope generally the information I've given you is very, very helpful. Next week we are discussing sewing machines a bit more in depth, because I really think that it's important to mention how to service your machine, basic service, because you still need to get a professional to check your machine every 3 months. And also some of the machine issues you usually have, especially when you're sewing, it can be very frustrating. Why is this thread looping? Why is it breaking in the middle of my sewing and all that? And sometimes it's something as simple as change your needle, or you threaded it wrongly, or there's a loop you missed. Because all our machines are different, but there's some common issues that people face with machines. So I'm going to go more in depth with sewing machines next week. I hope you've enjoyed this week's video. Welcome new subscribers. Thank you for all the people who are leaving me awesome comments. I really appreciate it. The reason I decided to do this machine specific video is because there's actually someone who asked me about machines last week, and I thought I would create this resource for them. In case you want me to mention where you can source for machines here in Kenya, I can be able to tell you. I think for people who are not in Kenya, I'll just link the machines available maybe on Amazon, and you can find the equivalent in your country. But in Kenya, there's some specific machines I would recommend because they are easier to service, because the spare parts are available easily in Kenya. So the people who maintain machines are very familiar with them. There are some brands that I know machine repair guys struggle with, because maybe the spare parts are very hard to get, or they're not familiar with the machine. So generally, my advice to you as a Kenyan is always buy a machine that has available spare parts and that the machine repair guys can easily fix for you. And sometimes it's just important to consult them, because they know machines that break down easily and the ones that last longer. I'm not saying all of them are trustworthy, but if you want the contact of the guy who services my machine, I'm very willing to give it to you, because if he remains in business, I still have a guy who services my machine. Anyway, I hope this was helpful, and I guess I'll see you next week. Bye. Thank you.